inspire a journey. All right. So today's session is about 90 minutes long, right? It comprises of two components. First part will be a mini workshop conducted by myself, talking a bit about, the personal branding, storytelling, to lay a bit of context, a bit of foundation. And then the juicy part will happen in the second half for the next 60 minutes, where we have two inspiring leaders, Kavita Hans and Teresa Norton, who will be sharing a little bit more about their journey, their thought process about storytelling, personal branding, and other tools that can help enable your career growth in the process. So without further ado, let me just quickly get started. I'm Sam, by the way, from Stories of Asia, and thank you so much for dialing in today. And of course, today's session is in partnership with Diageo to celebrate International Women's Day. And so this month, in the month of March and a little bit of early April itself, we will be partnering on a series of content, a series of initiatives. So we just launched a series of podcasts. So do dial in the Stories of Asia podcast if you haven't dialed in yet. Of course, today's session is one. We'll have a series of articles coming up as well. So stay tuned and let's get started, right? Okay. So today's session, like I mentioned, is titled Tell Your Story, Inspire Journey. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be covering a bit more in terms of personal branding and how can you utilize that, right, through storytelling, through different means to grow your personal brand and enhance your career. But before I start, right, I'd like to engage you guys a bit further to hear your thoughts, right? What is your understanding when it comes to personal branding? Could you type in the chat box one word, one phrase, one sentence? What comes to mind when you think of the words basically personal branding? Can we take about 30 seconds for this, please? Okay, Maylin says what you stand for. Thank you. Jonathan says bring your authentic self. Kavita says credibility. I see purpose. Thanks, Kimberly. I see identity, your values. Anything else? The value you can offer. Okay, thanks, Anita. Wishing says personal values. Quite a lot of values I'm seeing so far. Anything else? Teresa says character. Mei says how others perceive you. Okay, so quite a bit in terms of perception, in terms of values, character. Thanks for all your inputs. Okay, so before I begin the whole session proper, let me start with a story, right? Since we're from Stories of Asia, let me start with a quick story over here. The guy on the left is me, in case you can't recognize. The guy on the right is actually a good friend of mine whom I met about almost 2 years ago. His name is Sean. He's the HR director of Under Armour Southeast Asia. So what happened back then was Sean was kind of a follower connection on LinkedIn. He's been following me for some time. We engaged a little bit on social media. And one day I decided, hey, why not, right? Just drop him a private message to say thank you, to see if he's keen, to kind of just catch up over coffee, to know him better since we are all HR professionals by training. So when I dropped him a private message, within the next hour, he replied and said, hey, let's just meet up next week. So the next week came, right? What happened was I dropped by his office just under Suntec. There's a cafe basically. We had a nice chat and we started off with this. Sean said, Sam, I remember this. He said, Sam, basically when any service provider or vendors drop me a message. So as a consultant now, right, I used to be HR professional in corporate, but now I'm a consultant. As a vendors usually when they write to me, right, what happens is I totally ignore them. Sean told me this. He said, but you are different because I seem to know you for a long time now. I know what you stand for. I know what you bring on table. And I like, the values that you have basically. And because of that, we met up. We started chatting about, things that he learned from what I shared and likewise for me. And after about 40 minutes or so, Sean asked me this question. He said, Sam, by the way, could you tell me a bit more about what you do from a commercial side? And is there anything that I can help you with? So I didn't broach anything about business, anything commercial, but that topic came out quite naturally after about 30 to 40 minutes or so. So at that point of time, it was quite interesting. For Stories of Asia, we were about 1 to 2 months close, or rather leading up to the launch itself. That was sometime in May, somewhere April or May or so, and we were due to launch in mid-June. What happened was a couple of months ago, a big multinational actually agreed to be our launch partner. But leading up to the event, they started ghosting on me. I texted them, I emailed them, no reply. And I was so stressed out, so worried that we couldn't launch our event. And Sean said this. He said, why not we do it together? He jumped in straight away in the first meeting. He said, we are a retail store, let's launch it together. And since then, we successfully launched it at Under Armour store, and the rest is history basically. And with this, I'm so thankful for people like Sean. And the key point the key point for this story, right, is really about personal branding, isn't it? If you build a strong personal brand, people know who you are, you establish trust, that's where a lot of opportunities unlock. Imagine if I didn't build any personal brand, Sean doesn't know me. In the first meeting, things wouldn't happen like that. So that's the point why am I sharing this story at the very beginning, because this is really why personal branding is so important. Okay, let me just move here. So basically, right, in the very old school term, if you think of personal branding, which is quite hyped up recently, it's essentially your reputation. What are you known for? What do people say about you? Which is some of the things that you guys mentioned. And most importantly, when it comes to reputation, right, what you want to do is you want to build trust. You want a brand, you want to be known for being a trustworthy person, someone that people can count on, basically. Because whether it's a teammate, right, internally, whether externally it's a client, whether it's someone who wants to approach you for help, they need to first trust you before they can engage you for something, whether it's commercial, non-commercial, essentially. So when you build a personal brand or reputation in that sense, think of how can you build trust. And when I say build trust, right, in terms of personal brand, it's not about self-promotion, right? So many people think of personal brand in a wrong way, where you see on social media, it's all about, what have I done? What have I achieved? I met this person, I won this award. A little bit is fine. Letting people know a bit of credibility is fine. But at the end of the day, right, you want to focus on not yourself, but the other person. Which brings me to the next point in terms of relationship building, right? Whether it's online on social media, which is a tool, or offline in person, ultimately your brand has to be consistent, has to be coherent. And the main thing that can strengthen your brand, right, is to build strong relationships. Through relationship like the one with Sean, for instance, right, or with Diageo, for instance, that's where trust is established. That's where opportunities get unlocked, whether it's internal as an employee or external, or even a student, for instance, looking for a job in that sense. So focus on building your relationship and not self-promoting. All right. And how do you build relationship? Essentially, the key thing here is adding value, right? People always want to associate themselves with people who, they can get something from that in some sense, right? What's in it for them? That's the key thing that people always think about when it comes to, a first meeting and stuff like that. And typically, how do you add value is you need to think of what's in it for them rather than what's in it for you. Okay, so a quick question over here, maybe the chat box. How many of you have heard of the concept called purple cow? It's a term coined by marketing guru Seth Godin. So maybe just a quick yes or no in the chat box itself. Have you heard of the term or the concept purple cow? Okay, no, no, yes, no, not really, no, yes, no, no, mostly says no. Okay, let me take you through a quick journey, right? So I know now we're all locked down pretty much, we can't really travel. Can I invite all of you just close your eyes and join me on a quick visualization session? Just a quick one. Just close your eyes, relax a little bit, but promise me don't fall asleep, okay? Just close your eyes, quick one. Okay, imagine this, right? You're taking a road trip. You just landed in New Zealand, okay? You pick up a car from, let's say, Hertz, for instance, right? You took a nice SUV with your family. You started driving down from the north to the South Island itself, okay? You started driving on a road trip. And at first, you started looking at the right side of your car, right? A lot of cows. It's so amazing because you don't get to see that in Singapore or Asia generally on the roadside, right? So you stopped the car, you started taking some pictures. It's pretty nice, right? The amazing sight. You got back onto the car, continued driving for the next 10 kilometers. You started seeing more cows. Well, it's still quite amazing, isn't it? Because it's still quite fresh to you. Went down, take more pictures, went back to the car. As you start driving 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, you started seeing more cows, but you started getting bored because all the cows just appeared to be black and white spots. Suddenly, suddenly a purple cow appeared. What happens next is that, hey, you thought, isn't it that interesting? Why is there a purple cow in the midst of, all these black and white cows, the brown cows in a sense, and you started going down? Not only did you start taking a picture, you started getting very curious. What actually happened? You're thinking, what happened? Why is it like that? And you started researching a little bit on your phone and stuff like that. Okay, so now slowly open your eyes, relax. All right. Imagine this, right? In the midst of social media, in the crowd that you're facing today, there's so many similar people out there, black and white cows out there. How do you become that purple cow that people will slow down, think about you, consider you, and be interested in having that conversation? That is what you want to do. So essentially, based on what we discussed previously, the points that I mentioned, think of this, the key pointers here as a purple cow, right? You need to think of how can you be remarkable? And by being remarkable, it's about what kind of value, first and foremost, what kind of value are you adding to the other person or the organization? That's the first thing that they want to know, right? Are you able to solve their problem or add value to them? Secondly, do you have a story that can connect with me emotionally? So there's a part on the rational bit, which is the value, objective and rational bit. There's a bit on the connectivity, the emotional bit, which is your story that you want to connect with them so that they feel something for you. And when you talk about personal branding, relationship building, don't start off with trying to sell them something. Just like Sean's case, right? I didn't focus on selling anything. I focused on giving value, building connections through my story. And that's where the natural sales part comes without you even having to sell anything, whether it's a job, whether it's a business, whatever it is, right? Or even a promotion even. So focus on giving value, focus on using a story to connect, and the sales part, in whatever form, will then come naturally if you position yourself as that purple cow. Okay? At this point of time, before I go on, any quick questions from the audience? If everything's okay, can you just put a okay? Can you put a thumbs up? Or if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat box. Can we take about 15 seconds for this? All right, thanks everyone. Okay, all good, all good. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. You know, it's very interesting because now that I started doing more face-to-face workshops, it's kind of weird again to do a Zoom workshop looking at the screen itself. So it's really helpful that you guys are engaging me. So thank you so much. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, so the next bit is this, right? When it comes to personal branding in today's digital age, one of the key components is then content creation. Content creation has become a very key part in terms of building your personal brand. And you often hear this term, right? Content is king. I agree to that, but there's actually more to this equation itself. So people always only stop at content is king. I'd like to add more to this royal family of content creation. So let me just add on. First and foremost, I would say context is then queen, right? You can have a lot of content on social media, for instance, but you need to put it in the right context so that it's relevant, so that people find value in the content they push out. And then it's not just about pushing out one time, two times, hoping that things go viral. Consistency is then the next bit that you need to think about. How can I constantly push out things that are thematic, that's consistent, that's relevant, and hence the content, the context, and consistency kind of forms that, you know, that royal family of content creation, which will then help you enhance your personal brand, at least on social media itself, right? So not only think of content which is spamming for a lot of people, think of the context and think of how can you be consistent on this journey itself, build a system around it. So next question you might then ask me, right, hey Sam, so you talk a lot about creating content. How do I even get started if I don't know where to get started, right? So I have a very simple 4-step process for you guys to take away. First and foremost, when you start thinking of creating content, think of what is your key message, what is your key objective. For example, today we're talking about how can we use storytelling and personal branding to, you know, drive your career growth, right? How can we empower women? How can we drive equality, for instance? That could be the main message, right? Once you have the main message in mind, the objective in mind, you move on to the next part, which is how can I capture the attention of people right at the beginning so that they will be keen to find out more about this topic itself. So from a media, a story angle term, we call it a hook. So typically from a content perspective, you can think of what is the catchy header that I can put or I can include so that it captures the attention of people, right? So of course, from a in a official term, we call it a hook. Some marketers actually use what they call like a clickbait, which is not the most ethical bit, right? So they trick you to enter and click on it. So for example, it can be like, um, this is how you can become a senior leader in 1 month, for example. Something that you know is not possible, but you get interested because it's a hook, essentially, right? So you want to have something that is obviously ethical, authentic, but something that captures the attention of people so that they want to click on it, they want to read more. And that's where your story can flourish from them, right? So the third part is then, what can I use to substantiate my key message, right? So usually in a short post, let's say on LinkedIn, for instance, think of maybe 2 or 3 short pointers that you can use to substantiate the main objective or main message, and that will kind of add credibility to your message itself. And this is also the part where you add value. Finally, right, I always say, you know, stories are amazing, it's interesting, it triggers emotions, but if you don't drive any action out of it, it's quite a pity, isn't it? So after all these things, having a key message, having a nice, you know, hook, attention grabber, have a good content base itself. The last part, think of how you can tie back to the heading, the message itself, and drive an action. So for example, is it, you know, check us out at a website? Is it, you know, start leaning in, for instance? What is the action that you want people to take? And from there, the whole story becomes coherent. Of course, this is not the most detailed framework, but for those who are just starting on this journey, think of a very simple 4-step framework, right? Key message objective, how can you capture the attention? What is the key meat or key content you can build in 2 or 3 simple pointers because people don't remember that much typically. And finally, what is the call to action? What do you want me to do after I follow your message itself? Okay. So hopefully this is useful for most of you who are just starting or just haven't started on this brand building journey itself. The next point is then this. Many people say, okay, so now Sam, I know that I can use a simple framework like this, but where do I find topics? How do I get started on this content journey? Where do I get inspirations, right? So one simple way is this. You need to start listening. Very often, why do I get so many ideas? If you follow me on my LinkedIn or if you search Sam Neo, SAMNEO, you'll see that I post quite often. I get a lot of inspirations. In fact, I have more ideas that I'm holding back basically. But where do I get all these ideas, all these inspirations? It starts from what we call social listening. Social listening can be on social media. It can be through conversations you talk to people. It can be, what people talk about beside you, even at a coffee shop or things like that. By listening, you know what's hot and what's the relevant topic in the market. And then you zoom in. You zoom in a little bit more to your audience, right? You need to then know based on the wide base, the wide funnel of topics that people are talking about, what is your audience talking about? What is relevant to your audience, right? So for example, myself as an entrepreneur, I work a lot with corporate leaders, corporate HR, corporate comms folks. I need to know what is of interest to them, right? For example, in HR space, you talk about employee engagement, talk about employer branding. So these are topics that are of interest to them. And hence, if this is my target audience, this is what they're interested in, I'll build content around these main topics. So first and foremost, start listening and then understanding who your audience is, because that helps you to zoom in and helps you to understand what is relevant, what is of value. Remember, once again, the purple cow, what is of value to them, and how can I use my story with that 4-step process to connect with them emotionally. And of course, finally, the call to action to allow them to drive change, to do things that you want them to do essentially. So essentially, like I said, is what drives them. What is the carrot they're dangling in front of them that piques their interest? Okay. So one simple way to then ensure that they follow what you want to say or if it's relevant to them is the concept of framing and positioning. I'll give you a very simple example over here. Think of an umbrella, right? All of us use an umbrella, but we use it for different purposes on different days, isn't it? For example, on a sunny day like today in Singapore, a really hot day, we can use an umbrella to block ourselves from the UV ray from perspiring, right? That's one way you can sell an umbrella to someone on a hot day. On a rainy day, you sell to someone an umbrella because it prevents them from getting wet, right? Because you don't want them to get drenched. And if you're to sell to someone who is very fashion driven, fashion conscious, for instance, you sell an umbrella as a fashion accessory, for instance. So think of this, right? An umbrella, a similar item, can be contextualized. Remember I mentioned that context is queen, right? Contextualized in different situations and framed in a different way that makes sense to different people in different occasions. So that's something to think about. Who my audience is, what are they looking for, and based on the item that I have, right? How do I sell it to them, positioning them to them in that sense that it makes sense at that point of time in that very context. So hopefully these are some practical tips that you can utilize quite quickly to kind of start building your brand, start telling your story, creating a bit of content to allow people, to know who you are and what you stand for essentially. Okay. So Jonathan says, sounds like a lot like a commercial strategy. I guess yes, to some extent, right? When it comes to personal branding, communication, a lot of times it's actually sales, right? It's not about selling a product, but essentially it's about selling your message, selling yourself in some sense. So in a way, I know most people might think that sales is just for salespeople, but in every day, aren't we trying to communicate, trying to sell something? Trying to sell a message, trying to convince someone to do something, to change something. So in a way, we are all salesperson in our own rights, just in different forms, essentially. All right. So thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for that. Okay. So really, I think if I can boil it down to a main message here, right? It's really all about them, not you. When it comes to personal branding, building your stories, it's about what's in it for them that makes sense to them, and then it will kind of reflect back to you. Right. So think of that. What's in it for them first before thinking of what's in it for you. So Hopefully this short sharing itself, short 20-minute sharing is useful. Some practical tips for you in terms of building a structure, in terms of thinking, how can you get started on the content building journey? How can you frame messages, that make sense to your target audience? And really, I think the final message that I would like to take away and the call to action is think about this, your personal brand building journey itself, your personal brand building um, journey or action itself is not instantaneous. It doesn't go viral straight away. It's a journey, right? It takes time. It takes consistency. It takes effort and commitment. So, you won't see result immediately, that I can assure you. But if you consistently experiment, put in the effort, follow some of these concepts, framework, and just adjust it accordingly to your context. Once again, contextualization matters. This journey will be fruitful. This journey will be meaningful. And with that, I wish you all the best. Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks. Hopefully enjoyed this short presentation itself. Okay, so with that, I'd like to take off my presenter hat now. I'm now the moderator for today's session. So maybe before I end and hand the time over, or rather kickstart the session with Kavita and Teresa itself, any quick questions, any quick comments in the chat box maybe? Let me know what you think about the session itself. Jules say thanks. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Nee. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Any comments, any questions? Happy to address it within the next few minutes before I move on. Thanks, Jonathan. Check out the book. There's actually a book called Purple Cup by Seth Godin, so it's quite insightful. Just check it out if you like. Yeah. John Ju says, I'll share the Purple Cup story with my children. Okay. Hopefully we get to see, we get to travel soon and, can use that real life story in New Zealand maybe, tell that story. That'd be really cool. Okay. So with that, I'll now kickstart the part 2 of it, which is the main session. Mine is more like an appetizer to whet appetite to keep you awake. And now let's start the main session, right? So with that, let me just switch off the share mode for now. Okay. Okay, so for now, let me just quickly introduce our two amazing leaders, our speakers for today. We have Kavita Hans, General Manager of Diageo Philippines, and we have Teresa Norton from StarMaker Hong Kong, right? So for a start, maybe can we get Teresa and Kavita, maybe Kavita first, right? To share a bit about yourself. And for those who are not familiar with what you do and not familiar with Diageo, for example, do you mind sharing a bit more about what Diageo does as well? Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for having us, and really looking forward to the rest of this workshop. There were some great tips and structure there to storytelling. I'll try and embed them into what I'm about to share now, maybe. So briefly, before I go into career and stuff, I'll share a bit about myself. You may take away from my accent, I'm from the UK. I'm a proud British Indian. My parents were immigrants to the UK many, many decades ago, having been born and bred outside of India as well themselves. So, before the age of 20, my dad had lived in 3 continents and 4 countries. So, come from quite a diverse background. My parents were, born and raised in East Africa for the majority of their earlier years. My brother arrived in the UK. So in terms of, those early years, quite a struggle, not too dissimilar from, a lot of immigrant stories, but my parents really turned it around. And what really helped them to turn it around, quite early on, they realized that if they want a different outcome and they want to shape a different outcome for us as a family, they decided that going into business via taking a bank loan, the very first bank loan my father took was like £5,000, I think, but in that time it was a lot of money. And they started their own business. So it was great, a really diverse upbringing. I grew up in a very small village called Bedhampton in southern England in Hampshire. We were the only brown family for miles. And so what was really great about that, though, is my parents, despite that being very strange for them, really embedded into the local community. My dad was an employer, so we used to employ like local kids. It was completely legal, don't worry, to do paper rounds. That was a very cultural thing. People used to get their newspapers delivered. He'd go into the pub across the road after work for drinks to mingle with the community, even though that's really not normal where he came from. My mum, who thinks it's important to have faith, we used to go to the church across the road after school. So really diverse upbringing. And later on, in life, as more people who looked like us moved to the nearby cities, my dad actually helped form an Asian community. and in associations, which he still is part of as a treasurer. And it was during this time that I really embraced the Indian side of my culture, because nobody in school, you know, etc., looked like me. And this is where I met other kids who were also second, third generation, you know, British Indians. And this is where I found my love for everything Indian, including clothes, the food. I was chatting to a colleague yesterday about Navratri, which is a celebration, Diwali. And then, you know, quite early on, I was, I'm using the word allowed, but I literally pestered my dad into, you know, seeing his home country. He grew up in Kenya. And so, you know, at the age of 16, 17, from memory, that was my first trip solo. I was like on the, you know, on a plane going there by myself. And so all of these influences have really helped shape who I am. But when it comes to career, because we had a family business, you know, people laugh when I tell them I started working before the age of 10, really, in my dad's shop and helping them out. They worked very long hours, and so my brother and I always helped. But I always knew I wanted a bit of independence, and I was like obsessed with the reps that used to come in and talk about their brands, etc. And they were great storytellers. And so, you know, obviously wanting to, you know, sell us something. And so at the age of 14, that's when it's legal in the UK to go into employment. I went and sought part-time jobs. So I've done waitressing. I've worked as in customers. I was not a very good waitress, by the way, and hence why it's, you know, probably hence why it was a part-time job. You know, I worked in customer service, and you know, also helped out in the shop. I've worked in retail, for example, Topshop, etc. And it was through, I truly believe it was through having those experiences. It wasn't so much about the employment or, you know, having pocket money. It was genuinely wanting to meet people outside of my small little village and going into the city every weekend. And it was through those experiences that I truly believe that's how I managed to land my first job at Mars UK from university. And I truly believe that that's what differentiated me from, you know, hundreds of applicants, because they were intrigued, you know, why I wanted to, you know, do that and why I did that. It wasn't so much the norm in those days, very much is now, I guess. And that's what set me aside. So, and then from that, Sam, pretty much have worked in FMCG companies. I didn't set out to be a general manager, and I've through brilliant mentoring and coaching, I've really found my way. You know, especially in the years that I've been at Diageo, and that's how I've ended up, you know, managing multiple businesses around Middle East, Asia, for example. I've worked for some amazing brands and with some amazing colleagues as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Kavita. That is very nice background story, actually. And actually, one takeaway that I have is that you need to be interesting, get people interested in you, and that's where a lot of opportunities get unlocked. And you also mentioned quite a fair bit in terms of things like mentoring and stuff. So I think that's something we can explore a little bit further. So with that, I'll hand the time over to Teresa. So on the topic of mentoring, it's quite relevant because she does a lot of executive coaching as well, right? So Teresa, over to you, a bit about yourself and what you do.
Thank you very much, Sam, and great storytelling, Kavita. I realize I have like a rainbow on my face, which is kind of groovy. I've got I've got a crystal thing that I have hung in the window. So that's what that is. Listen, my background, you know, I grew up in San Francisco, California. My parents were older when they had me. My brother's 12 years older than I am, and there's nobody in between. So even amongst all the cousins and everything, I was like the baby. And the universe kind of went, when I arrived, and I also had a penchant for theater. So all of this attention and all of this love and support encouraged my theatrical bent. And I worked in, my first job in professional theater was with the San Francisco Spring Opera. And then my boyfriend at the time and I decided to take an adventure, and we moved to Guam, of all places, which all of our friends were like, really? Guam? Like, what? But he had grown up, you know, traveling a lot, Joe had, and Guam seemed like a, you know, sort of a, it was far enough away from the US, and it was still, you know, it's where America's day begins. It's an American territory, so we could work there. And I ended up getting my very first job in radio, Well, I have to kind of jump back a little bit in my story and say that there was a morning guy on the radio station that I used to listen to, KSAN in San Francisco when I was in high school. I loved this guy. He was so theatrical. He used a lot of characters and he get the audience involved in a lot of things. I thought he was great. And he was hosting a New Year's Eve gig at some bar. I mean, we were too young to be going to this bar, but we went anyway. And I went up and I started talking to him. And he started talking to me and we were exchanging these character voices. And he said to me, God, you'd be great in radio. And I looked at him at 19 with this kind of arrogance and said, I'm an actor. And then 2 years later, I'm working at a radio station in Guam. So, you know, this haughty idea that no radio for this gal, you know, I'm an actor, ended up being, you know, a wonderful career opportunity for me. And I got into doing voice work, voiceovers for commercials. And I was working at this little radio station in Guam, and the morning guy there had a lot of faith in me. And he said, you know, Teresa, you should be in a bigger market. You could work anywhere. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, I'll help you. I'll help you. And this was like the morning guy that everybody thought was a jerk because he, you know, he had such a big ego and everything, right? But he was so kind to me and he helped me. And I got one of the guys who was sort of a friend of in our posse, was a professional photographer, took the headshots and we put the little CV and the demo tapes together and sent them off. And I got responses from 4 radio stations in Hawaii that said, we'd like to hire you. So I ended up moving to Honolulu and worked for a radio station there. And it's a very competitive market in Hawaii. You live and die by those you know, the ratings there. It's very competitive. At least at that time, everybody was listening to the radio and there were a lot of stations. So I learned a lot working there. I also, you know, I look back on my career and I think I got so many breaks. I got so many lucky breaks, you know, going in and getting a job in radio. You know, how did I audition for this job in radio? Because I thought, yeah, I'm an actor. I could act like a radio announcer. And that's what I did. Then after that, you know, I ended up marrying this fellow, and he was in Hong Kong, and I loved visiting him here. And there was a professional theater company here, so I could get back into theater again. So I had a radio show here. I did a lot of voiceover work for commercials, and I also was working with a professional company that had been started by some Brits who were in Hong Kong. So this was back in 1983. I have been in Hong Kong for almost 40 years. So it is very definitely my home. And I worked at a radio station called Commercial Radio, and I engaged a lot of theater, a lot of character voices. What I learned from that morning guy, I incorporated in my own show. And so I had a lot of different characters. And then I stopped doing that, focused more on theater. And then I was offered another job by one of the guys who had started the radio station in Hawaii. And I worked for a different company here, and I was doing the morning show. And when that job came to an end, it was the first and only time I'd been fired from a job in my life. And I was shocked. I was like, you're firing me? What are you, nuts? I'm indispensable. I'm the morning gal, right? Nobody's indispensable. Believe me, nobody is indispensable. So here I was, you know, and because I was the morning person, there was a lot in the newspaper about this and the press was calling up. It was a very embarrassing situation for me. It was a really tough thing for me to go through. And once again, you know, I got this amazing opportunity. Somebody from the newspaper, the South China Morning Post, called me up and said, gee, we're so sorry to hear that you're not doing your radio show anymore. Love that show. Would you be interested in writing a column? I said, oh, I mean, I've never written a column before, write for the theater, but they said, oh, you'll be great at it. I said, what do you want me to write about? They said, anything you want. And I said, are you going to pay me for this? And they said, yes. And I said, well, there's an offer you can't refuse, right? Okay. So the thing for writers, that whole thing of starting with a blank page is very daunting, right? Any of you who had to sit down and create something, it's those first lines that are tough. So what I decided to do was something that actually I realized my mother did, because she wrote a recipe column when I was growing up. And I used the same opening every single week. And for 7 years in the South China Morning Post, I had a column that began, I don't know, maybe I'm nuts, and then I would talk about whatever was going on in my life. And at that point in time, there wasn't anybody in Hong Kong who was writing with a personal voice. So this was like a groundbreaking thing, to talk about my family, to talk about my kids. Sam, I know that you feature your child very much. You're an entrepreneur dad, right? An entrepreneur parent. And, incorporating my real life into this column made it a very personal story that I was telling, and talking every week about just what was on my mind and what was happening in my life. So now we go ahead to where I am today. 20 years ago, I started applying everything that I'd learned from radio, from newspaper, and particularly from theater, to working with corporate clients, with leaders on communication. And I've worked with Diageo in London. I've worked with a lot of different companies, multinational companies, and a lot of local companies here and in China. And 6 years ago, my son joined me in my business. So my business partner is half my age and my son. So we're a multi-generational team. And also he's fluent in Mandarin, so we have a bilingual aspect to this. And it's been an amazing journey. So that brings us up to date now. We employ theater and his background in psychology in helping people to authentically and effectively communicate their leadership and tell their own stories. And with that, and they lived happily ever after.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you so much. So now you guys know why I invited these two amazing leaders on this topic. Tell your story and to inspire a journey. They tell really good stories. And that's why I wanted to kind of lead on from this topic itself to maybe Kavita, right? From a storytelling perspective, from a corporate level itself, any practical tips that you can share with our audience? How do you tell stories that are purposeful, that can drive agenda, that can drive proper messages? And any tips around this that you can share with us, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, I'm still on a journey. I don't believe your personal brand or, the skill set that you gather in terms of storytelling, that journey ever really ends. So I've learned already a lot from both of you today. So thank you. And so I'm still on that journey, and, I can share some life tips of what, I would have done differently perhaps, and, what's worked for me through that learning process. And if we go back to something that most of us will have done in our career in some way, shape, or form, it's interviewing. And that's the perfect opportunity to tell a story. I've interviewed quite a bit over the last few years. I haven't given so many interviews, which is a good thing. But and a lot of interviewees the first question you sometimes get asked is, tell me a bit about yourself. And really listen to that question, right? Because they're not asking you to reel off your CV in chronological order. We have your CV in front of us. We can check also LinkedIn profiles now. That's the perfect opportunity to really add flavor and color, really connect with your interviewee. If you've done your research, hopefully you'll know a bit about them, so you can bring in elements of your backstory to really make that connection, firsthand. And be consistent, as well with that. It takes a lot of practice. And, one suggestion I have is, this is something that, of course, you can practice on your own, but it's also great to really start shaping that story with a mentor. And interviews are one of the best places to bring that to life. I think that really sets you apart from your competition, gives you that edge, and really upfront helps to form a view of who you are, what your passions are, what drives you. And you don't have to tell your whole backstory, you'd be there all day otherwise, but just bringing a little elements in, something that can even connect you to the organization that you're working for, or the person in front of you has helped me in the past, Sam. And during interviews, if I'm ever asked to give feedback now, I somehow try to incorporate that for those candidates that, have been quite just more black and white or traditional in their storytelling.
So let's talk a bit about this interview concept. So like you mentioned, interview is a very great place to tell stories, to kind of shine a little bit. So how do we strike a balance between telling just enough versus, telling too much or not having enough, connection with the interview itself? What's your take on this?
Well, it's very hard to go off onto a tangent, isn't it? Especially when you've got such an open-ended question. And I think that's why it takes practice, Sam. And you can form a network of 2 or 3 people that you really trust to give you open and transparent feedback. And at first when you because it's all about perception as well, and sometimes how you want to come across is not maybe how you do. So that's what's really worked for me, having a couple of people who I really trust, who I can run things by, and start practicing that. And I think balance is everything, so that you don't go off onto a tangent.
Cool. So you mentioned a few points in terms of when it comes to all this interviews, for instance, right? Sharing your backstory, sharing what you're passionate about. And so one important point that you mentioned is about listening and connecting, right? It's not just about preparing a script to just say everything you prepared, but are you listening to what the interviewer is actually looking for? Are you connecting with them based on what they need? And I think this is some important points that Kavita you mentioned. So thanks a lot for the practical tip over here. How about Teresa? Any thoughts around, at a corporate level, based on people you have met and coached in that sense? Any practical tips around storytelling for that? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think first of all, I would say it's when and I've just been coaching a lot of people around this, people who are going back into the market, who have had jobs for a long time and lost their jobs and now having to interview again. And I remind them that it is like the theater. Actors get very uncomfortable auditioning. It's like, God, I hope I get it. But the fact of the matter is that director is thinking, God, I hope they're the right person. I really don't want to audition 500 more people for this part. It's the same thing with interviews. They want you to do well. They don't want to have to look at 500 more people. They're hoping that you will be the one. So that is one thing that I would keep in mind. Another thing in terms of confidence, I would say, remember you're interviewing each other. It's not just them judging you. You're going in there and making a judgment about whether this is a place you want to work. And these are the kinds of people you'd like to work for. I would also say that in terms of storytelling, an exercise that you might find helpful is to do a timeline of your career. And I say start with the first paying job that you had, whatever that was. And you do a timeline. And what I ask my clients to do is draw lines up that represent your successes, your wins, the things that you're proud of. And then I'd like you to draw lines going down of the disappointments, the failures, the things you saw as mistakes. And then explore that in terms of your character. And this is where we talk about your brand. Who are you? What are the qualities that you possess? The qualities you possess that serve you, and the qualities that you possess that sometimes may be the very same thing that get in your way. And to be able to look at those and know what the qualities are that you have, then you know how to manage and navigate your brand a little bit more securely. And when you go into interview, you can talk about the qualities that you have and what you've learned from the things that were difficult from you, or the qualities that you had that contributed to those successes. And I think that makes it a nice, simple way to talk without feeling that you're, maintaining some humble arrogance, we might say.
So maybe Teresa and Kavita, at this point in time, I think there's a commonality that both of you shared. That's in terms of that active listening bit, right? How do you listen? What they're looking for is a two-way conversation, and then how you shape your character based on what Teresa said, and how do you shape backstory based on what Kavita shared. So maybe Teresa first, right? How can we then listen to, or what can we do in terms of listening skills wise, right? To find out what is the interviewer actually trying to find out, or what is the story that they want to hear actually?
Well, I have two suggestions here. Of course, improvisational theater is a great tool for getting present and being actively engaged with another person. Improv theater simply means theater that is not scripted. So if the two performers are on stage and there is no script, they have to actively be paying attention to what the other person is giving them so that they can build off of that. The other thing that I would say is a preparatory piece. And this in our sort of signature rock star presentations, which is what I did for Diageo, is it's influential presentation skills. And one of the things that I came up with, which was a tool that was originally used for actors to prepare for a scene in a play, is I call it the needs analysis. And what you're doing then is you're getting as many facts as you can possibly put together about the person that you're going to be talking to. And then identifying what it is that you want them to do, which in an interview would be hire you. And then you bounce what the facts are about that person off what it is that you want them to do to identify what do they need to feel in order to take that action. So sometimes when I'm doing this with clients, when they're talking about doing sales pitches and things, and I'll say, how much time do you spend actually paying attention to the facts about your audience, these people that you want to buy your product or you're trying to influence? Most people don't spend much time about that at all. They spend most of their time thinking about what they're going to say instead of thinking about what that audience needs to feel in order to act on the message.
Cool. That's very useful. So you mentioned about needs analysis, about the concept of improv theater. How about Kavita? Anything that comes to mind when it comes to listening during an interview, for instance?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the time, going back to Teresa's earlier point around it's a two-way thing. And if I look back on my career, or if I look back on the colleagues that I've worked with, what's worked well is that the candidate comes in just as well prepared to really delve deeper into the organization. What are they? Of course, there's lots of information available in the public domain now. Who did you speak to outside of going into that interview? Do you have any connections at that organization? You can really start to get a flavor of it, and then you can confirm some of this, right? In the interview as well, by being really well prepared. So the pre-prep, but really listening and homing in on the couple of words that are important to you about culture and the place you're going to work. How does it look to progress your career? Hearing the story of the person that's interviewing you as well, if they're going to share that. And so I think that stops you from having maybe or making a decision about working somewhere that may not actually be right for you. You may really, really want that job, but when you go into that interview, what's worked very well for me is homing in on that, and within a few minutes, I will know whether I want to work in that organization or not, or whether I want to go and work in that team or not. And that comes from listening. I really built this. I love to talk, in case you can't tell, but I really built this through proactive feedback much early on in my career. So my background is commercial. I'm a salesperson. And, when you first start out, you're so driven and motivated. You want to go in to whatever you're selling, and you want to do your pitch, and you want to succeed, get the orders or whatever it is that you're requesting, and then go. How many times do commercial and salespeople actually really, really listen to what customers are telling us about their shoppers, about their consumers, about the shopper journey? And it was not until I got this feedback that I had that aha moment of I should be listening way more than I'm talking. And that whether you're sitting in front of a customer or whether you're giving an interview, I think that's true. To really home in on what somebody's trying to tell you.
I'm going to jump in here and Kavita, and just say another one of the tools that I will share with my clients is think like a journalist. As the other person is talking, if you've got, listen, I've got monkey brain, it goes all over the place, and I'm thinking ahead and I'm thinking back, and to be able to think, if I had to write this as a story, like I'm interviewing them, then it helps you to stay focused, and you pick out key words that you want to build on. And then you can always go back and say to the person, you mentioned earlier, blah, blah, blah. And remember that you can always talk about what you want to talk about. Answer the question. Yes, if they ask you a question, you need to answer it succinctly. But then you can use it as a springboard to talk about what you want to share with them about the qualities that you will bring to that job.
I'd like to jump in quickly with a quick question over here, right? So is there a most memorable candidate that you have interviewed before? Of course, a successful candidate, not the kind of candidate that flopped badly, right? Because I'm asking this because I remember, right, I think my very first internship that I got was quite interesting, because when I went in straight away, right, what happened was I started asking the first question instead of the hiring manager asking me a question. And with that, he got very interested, he got very intrigued, he started sharing a lot of stuff. He asked me one or two questions and he started sharing more. And that was when he offered me the job on the spot itself. So I just want to ask, right, from your point of view, both of you, Kavita, Teresa, um, was there anything around this storytelling bit where you felt stood out for you, at least from interview perspective?
Yeah, I can go. Thanks, Sam. Something really sticks out actually, and it was quite a few years ago, probably 10 years or more or so ago. And it was a colleague and I that had we were in the office getting ready to interview an external candidate who was coming in, and they didn't show up. And they didn't show up, when they were supposed to. So, 15 minutes passed, didn't think, too much of it at the time. Through the agency, just tried to get hold of them. And they met with, a personal incident that morning in their family, which they had to resolve, and it just completely skipped their mind that they need to, attend this interview. And they asked if they could reschedule later on that day, believe it or not. And so, they came in later on that day, and the way that they just immediately bearing in mind, 9 times out of 10, if you've been late for an interview, whatever the circumstances, you probably would put it off for another day. And I thought that was just so brave. And then to come back in again, and then also just share what happened that morning, and share the backstory of why that happened. I mean, I'm not going to share it now, but just with such authenticity, with such emotion as well, that we offered them the job actually. They well, I think they're still working for that business, but you couldn't help but really connect to them. We had all been there when it came to the situation that they found themselves in, and when you're just trying to look after your family. And it was just that real human connection. And if you ever find yourself, what I learned from that, and the takeout of that, if I ever found myself in that situation, I think whoever is on the other end of the line is also a human being. And I'm normally I would give a corporate reason, traffic or whatever, and that's not the case actually. So be authentic, and that really helped that candidate.
So authenticity, and also if I can quickly add on what Kavita is saying, is also the courage to tell the truth and present the truth to. So that's a very important point. Teresa, yourself?
I'm going to jump in with something. I haven't, really done a lot of interviewing of other people. We have a smaller organization, and I didn't interview my son. I kind of birthed him instead. But what I am thinking about going in to talk to clients, HR clients about business. And a few years ago, when Steve Wynn was opening the Wynn Resort in Macau, I had gone through the initial process of meeting a couple of the GM of the hotel that was going to be the hotel and everything. And I like doing that. I like Kavita. I enjoy talking, and I'm a pretty natural salesperson. I enjoy that. But the thing was, everybody there was like crazy about, who, I hope Steve likes her. I hope he likes her. If he doesn't like her, he's not going to hire her. And I thought, I'm going to go nuts with this. One of two things is going to happen. Either I'm going to get all caught up in this crazy, gosh, I hope he likes me, or I'm going to go the other way and go, you know what? I don't care if he does like me. And neither one of those is very good for going into a job interview. So I thought to myself, you know what I need to do? I need to go in curious. I want to go in curious to see if this is a good fit. And I would tell anybody who goes to a job interview, if you can tuck some curiosity into your pocket and try and let that be the emotion that takes you through there, instead of a desire to either be liked or be annoyed. It's helpful.
I think what both of you share is quite interesting, because I don't think it's only applicable for interviews, right? I think, of course, the kind of context we're discussing now is for interviews, but think of it as every time we meet someone new, whether it's our new colleague, whether it's a client or whatever it is, it's an opportunity to showcase what your brand is all about, right? Like both of you said, it starts from listening. It uses a bit of concept of needs analysis, improv. It's about using a bit of backstory to connect emotionally. So I think it's not about the interview. I think there's a context we're discussing, but how do we use these different tools, that Teresa, that Kavita mentioned at every opportunity, especially when you're meeting someone for the first time? I think that's a very good way to start shaping the first impression in that sense. So now let's move on a bit more in terms of personal branding specifically, right? So maybe starting back to Teresa first, right? From personal branding point of view, all of us have a designated perhaps image we want to have, an ideal image, right? I want to be known as authentic. I want to be known as a giving person, for example. Are there any challenges for you specifically when it comes to building your personal brand? And maybe anything that you can share with us in terms of overcoming it from a mindset, from an actual journey perspective.
Okay, first of all, I'm 65 years old.
Really? You're serious?
So, I'm dealing with all, and my background was in theater and radio. So my brand was built through my work.
Hmm.
I say this again with humble arrogance. I had a reputation. In fact, I'll tell you a quick little story. I joined the American Chamber here at one point when I was just starting my different form of my entertainment business. And one of the guys there was a guy who was opening Disney here. And he said to me after one of these AmCham meetings, he says, you've got quite a reputation in town. And I said, oh, really? And he said, you have a reputation for being very good and very expensive. Don't change either one of those. And I thought, okay, that's a nice thing to hear from Mr. Disney. And that preceded me. And I think what he was talking about was professionalism. And I took pride in my work. I think I was blessed with a certain degree of talent, in the areas that I worked in, radio and voice work and the column and all of that stuff. There has to be some creative talent at the heart of this, but it's also discipline and suiting up and showing up and getting the job done efficiently so that you're not wasting other people's time. Then you can charge what you want to charge, which was, kind of the way that went. So I think in terms of personal brand and the internet and all of this, look, I am learning from Sam. Well, Sam Neo, but also my Sam, my son, because this is a whole nother arena. So I'm very interested in hearing what Kavita has to say about this, because, I'm an old school, Broadway baby. So I'm very keen to hear what you have to say, Kavita.
Well, I'm flattered that you think that I'm young enough to be one of those who is building my brand on social media. Unfortunately, it's still very much a journey for me, but looking forward to learning also from people like Sam and my colleagues. In terms of, so from a slightly different perspective then, in terms of, let's take the company that I work for at the moment, Diageo. Absolutely love working here. And how have I built my personal brand or my credibility and my reputation here? This terminology is relatively new for me, Sam. So, a couple of years ago, I hadn't necessarily heard of personal branding and the relevance and the importance of this. And back then we were more talking about what is it that you want to be known for? What is it that if I ask, your previous 3 bosses, or if I ask your leadership team, or if I ask 5 people in Diageo, what is it that they will say that you stand for and what you're about? What is it that they can come to you for and they know that you will deliver? And so it's not an overnight success story, as you would say, Sam. It takes years of commitment, consistency, and hard work, and learning, being humble enough to know when sometimes you get it wrong, and taking on board those learnings. And so, one of the things that I'm known for now in the business is I'm a big endorser of females in non-traditional roles. Coming from a background of being in a non-traditional role myself, especially when I first started working in the alcohol industry, for sure you did not see females, even in the UK, in a developed market, in the alcohol industry, and for sure you did not see women who look like me from an ethnic minority. And so I get as I progressed through my career and I went on to live and work in other countries, from a cultural perspective, I used to get a lot of questions such as, from partners as well, from colleagues sometimes. Oh, so you traveled here by yourself? For example, when I started traveling to India on business, so you traveled here by yourself. How did you arrive from the hotel to the meeting today? How did you get from the airport? And does your husband allow you to work? Does your husband mind that you work in the career that you do, that takes you, on trips away from your home, etc.? What do your parents say, being an Indian? And I realized quite quickly that those questions weren't coming from a point of judgment. They were coming from a point of intrigue, because you don't see many females in those roles. And so what I'm known for now is, if anybody approaches a colleague to say, look, what we're finding is in more senior levels, director, etc., we're finding that at middle management, we do have a great gender diversity balance in commercial roles. But, as you get further along your career, we're finding that that females drop out. Would you mind speaking to this person? We're considering for the role, they want to progress, they want to be a GM, and maybe you can share a story. And so, over the last couple of years, that's where a lot of my mentoring and coaching has been focused, because I've got live examples of how you can make it work. Some days it will work, and some days, and I share that, be as transparent as I possibly can with that. So that's what I will know for. And there's other things as well, but I think very relevant on the topic of women choosing to challenge, and the conversation that we're having today. That's the reputation that I've built, not always intentionally either, but that's what I'm known for in terms of my mentoring work at the moment.
So on the topic of mentoring, Teresa, anything to add on? I think since you are on the topic of coaching, mentoring, anything to add on to this?
Well, I just love what you're saying about, sort of stepping outside of your comfort zone and not feeling like you have to be confined into a certain role. I often talked about people going outside of their comfort zone and acting as if, in terms of their ability to demonstrate confidence, for example, or respond differently than what they naturally would to a situation. And I think in terms of it as being like a painter's palette, I've got this colorful painting behind me, and that we tend to, always go to the same reactions. Same thing comes up, we give the same reaction. And for me, the beauty of incorporating theater into this work is to encourage people to try some different colors, try some different ways of being, some different ways of behaving in a safe atmosphere when you're in a coaching relationship, or if you're in a training situation, so that you can experiment with things that are outside of your comfort zone. I really liked what you were saying, Kavita, about this curiosity that people had, not coming from a standpoint of being judgmental, but really being curious and interested to know what this unusual, what they saw as an unusual role for a woman was like for you. And I think what a wonderful legacy that this has now informed the way that you want to bring women into a broader palette of career opportunities. That's just great.
Before I move on, right, just to all the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I know all of you are very immersed in the story, just like myself. But feel free to ask any questions so that we can kind of address some of these concerns that you may have, or any interesting things that you'd like to find out from Teresa and Kavita. So Kavita and Teresa, just now both of you mentioned quite a fair bit in terms of, the good work that you've done, right? Showcases on its own, and that's how you kind of grow your career, your message itself. I think a lot of people, especially within the Asia context itself, what happens is most of them work really hard, a lot of good work happens, but they kind of lack the ability or confidence, right, to kind of articulate that value. And very often a lot of opportunities are lost because of that inability or inertial to show that value itself. So what's your take around that? How do you encourage others to step up, or how can they start sharing their message while not bragging or showing off or self-promoting in that sense? Or what do you think about this?
Well, I'll jump in here and say that, first off, it goes back to what I was saying before about having an honest examination of the qualities that you bring, that have been your successes and failures, and what you've learned, so that you can talk about qualities and how they have impacted the business. It's easier for many people to talk about that than it is to say, I'm great at this, or I'm super good at that. That would be one thing that stands out to me.
Kavita, any thoughts?
I think in the, interest of inclusivity, everybody will do it in their own way, in their own style. And, there's not a copy paste model. What works for me, because of the traits, my background, etc., may not work culturally for somebody else. And so, I think it's about baby steps, even just sharing your story with a couple of people, as I said, who you trust, and really building it from there. But I would say also to the leaders, on this workshop today, provide the platforms for those opportunities as well. I've been, the mentors and the line managers that I've had, through sharing my story, etc., recognize that this is not something that I'm naturally comfortable with. I'm a salesperson, yes, tell me to go and talk about Johnny Walker all day long, ask me to talk about my purpose, or ask me a question about that. And, I would like to think I've evolved a little bit since then. And so, they recognize that, and I'm so grateful for that. They recognize the potential that I could possibly have, but it was about creating those platforms for me. And I'll give you a live example of this. Many years ago in Diageo, when I was based in Dubai, the MD that I used to work for had invited our CEO over to meet a customer. And, because they were meeting the customer, the bulk of his time there was taking up doing, having a business review, etc. And however, he still carved out, it was just 20 minutes, but he still carved out 20 minutes for me to meet with the CEO and present the business that I manage and my team. And I'll forever be, because the prep that you would put into that in terms of storytelling, etc., really provided me with, better opportunities in the future as well. And so I would say, provide the platforms, to the leaders to unlock some of that if you see somebody with potential. And that's what's really worked well for me as well, Sam.
Okay,
I'm
cool.
going to jump in here and just say that, a lot of my work as a coach is about helping leaders understand what theater directors know about getting the best out of talent. And one of the things that comes to mind is this idea of praising that which is praiseworthy and praising it generously. That's a quote from theater director William Ball, and I think it's a beautiful quote about leadership. It's not about praising things that aren't worthy of praise, but finding ways to appreciate in a generous fashion the good work that people are doing. And for some leaders, this comes quite naturally. And from some of the leaders I work with, they have to learn. They have to act as if until they're able to do it naturally.
Okay, I think we have a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me just take them quickly. So I think Diojins, I hope I pronounced your name properly. Teresa, the question is to you. 40 years in Hong Kong, that is something. Please talk a little bit about the language challenges while starting it up to this day. So maybe a bit of initial days in Hong Kong. How do you navigate through the language challenge?
Listen, thank you for asking about that. When I first came to Hong Kong, of course, I determined that I was going to become a fluent Cantonese speaker. And my teachers were going to be my taxi drivers. And I got some good basic taxi driver Cantonese. But, I'm a very lazy person. And in all of the jobs that I had, although I was working with primarily locals, we were always working in English at the radio stations and, in the recording studio and all of that. So my son really saves my face because although he grew up here, he went to an English Schools Foundation, but he is fluent in Mandarin. So at least I can say I'm an idiot and don't speak anything but English, and I kind of struggle with that sometimes, but my son can speak Mandarin. And my experience in Hong Kong has been a magical one. I've had tremendous opportunities and I love this place. And it's home to me after almost 40 years. It's definitely home for me.
Cool. Jonathan has a question for Kavita. So alcohol is perceived to be a male-dominated business. Is it harder for women leaders to cut through? What's your take on that, Kavita?
I'll give you another live example. So I've been working in the alcohol industry for nearly 15 years, just over 14. And until 18 months ago, I'd never had a female boss. And in the last 18 months, I've had 2, which is just, and there's many stories like mine. I've got many friends who are in the industry as well. So that just shows you, whilst it's not perfect, especially if you look at the industry in more senior roles. But there's absolutely progress, and I think as Diageo we're very much leading that. And some other examples to share with you as well. When I first started working in the alcohol industry, I was the only female, believe it or not. I started, my background is from beer, so I started working for a brewer in the UK. And we used to entertain a lot at rugby, football, cricket, and because of the sporting platforms as well. And so during that time, all of my external base as well were male. And so I remember holding down conversations for anything other than work was harder to cut through, because you were not included in everything. And I remember when I was going to my first rugby match. I mean, I grew up with a brother and a cousin. I'm genuinely interested in football, but not so much cricket and rugby. I remember watching a couple of matches before going to this, because I needed something else to connect with my external network on, and my partners who I was going to be spending 3 hours at a match with. So yes, I believe I believe when I first started, it was definitely harder, but I think the industry has made great progress.
So a follow-up question quickly here then, right? So I'll just quickly read the question. With all your background story to arrive at senior leadership level, building a strong behavior and baggage to progress to the ladder inside Diageo, now what do you think are challenges for new people who are just starting their journey, being also a member of minority and not represented on the senior leadership level? I think it's pretty much what you shared, but anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really relevant point. So, in certain cultures, and certainly in mine, Sam, when I first started working out, my mum doesn't drink. Like, she'll have the odd glass of wine now, but women in my family don't drink. It's culturally not okay, and also not have been exposed. And so when I first started working, and I've also worked in the Middle East. I mean, also where alcohol is not widely accepted. And so when I first started working in India, my team was, fully male. I was approached by an internal candidate because she was aware that I was, hiring for some commercial roles. And one of the first questions that she asked me is, me being in a supply chain role where I'm full-time office-based in the alcohol industry is okay and acceptable with my family. However, I'm for this role, I would be relocating, and it's a customer facing role. Can you share your experiences with me of how you manage this with your family? How is it going to be? Am I going to be expected to drink when we go out? Am I going to be expected to be working late at night, etc.? And this is an off-trade role, so not necessarily. And and this was only 18 months, a couple of years ago, and it just goes to show you that even within the industry, people have these questions when it comes to progression or moving cross-functionally. And the questions concerns are very valid. And I think that's why it's great to, air that and have the open conversations, and maybe link in with somebody whose career path, who may be from an ethnic minority like you and may understand your culture. And so yeah, and she's now enrolled, and it's been a couple of years and performing very well. And she doesn't drink, and there's absolutely no pressure to do that. I believe many years ago, I think it was different when I first started out in the UK.
So actually, it's a very nice lead into the next question for Teresa. So Jonathan is asking, what's the one tip you would give to an introvert to ensure their voice can be heard without them being so uncomfortable they fluff the lines? I think it's kind of ties in quite nicely, actually.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's going back a ways, I used to describe people sometimes this way. I would say there are hot people and there are cool people. And it's hot to be hot and it's cool to be cool. And hot people have that sort of driving energy. I am like 1,001 degrees of that kind of energy. But then there are people that we would classify perhaps as more introvert, and they lean back and they're cool. And people perform because they want to please them. in terms of a leadership role. And I think it's to be able to own that introversion, to be able to own that quiet strength, and to realize that confidence and extroversion are not linked necessarily. I think it's much more important for you to settle yourself and develop a clear structure for getting your point across. I think that's what can happen for most people, extrovert or introvert, that when they're in the spotlight, the mind goes blank and they're off on some tangent and they feel like they can't get the structure of what they wanted to say across. One of the tools that I like to use is a storytelling tool that is a sort of first, then finally. If you can go through chronological order and say, and just do 3 sentences and say to the person, if you'd like me to go into more detail, I can go into detail later. But at the beginning of my career, blah, 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 blah. Within the last 5 years, I've da, 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 da. And today I'm interested in doing blah, 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 right? So if you've got that nice, succinct little story in mind, don't worry about being the most dramatic person in the room. Just own that cool confidence, I would say.
Oh, I like the first, then, finally concept. I mean, it's a simple framework, but it guides you through. In particular, when you're panicking, when your mind goes blank, having a framework in mind, it helps a lot, definitely. You can slowly fill in the blanks, I guess. That helps a lot. So thanks a lot. I think there's a question from Claudia, which is quite interesting to both of you. Maybe starting from Kavita, right? So who inspires you the most outside of your family and why?
Outside of my family, Sam, I would have to say my friend circle. It's truly amazing the females that I've come across in my personal and work life. A lot of colleagues that I've met along the way are actually now some of my bestest friends. We've been to each other's weddings. I'm guardian to one girl's kids, etc. And it's these women it's the untold stories, the ones which your nearest would know about. To give you some examples, one of my bestest friends, she lost her husband when her little girl was only 3 months old, and in a foreign country, because this was in the Middle East. And her little girl is now just celebrated her 8th birthday, and she's gone from just surviving to thriving. She's now working 2 jobs, and she's started her own business a few years ago. Another friend in the UK who is single-handedly bringing up her 3 triplet girls, because she's a single mother now. And when they were only, I think, 2 or 3 when she became a single mother, since then she's gained a degree and a master's in psychology. Another friend who, despite having had very bad COVID very recently, and been hospitalized, she's a frontliner medic for the NHS in the UK. She's now running vaccine centres, and I've got many like that. And and I think it's these ladies that I find most inspiring. Of course, there are many in the more famous public domain, celebs, etc., and they're known for many firsts, but it's the women in my everyday life. I'll give you another example. I started my career off at Mars. I'm still really good friends with 5 girls there, and they're all around the world now, as am I. But one of them must have seen seen the LinkedIn post for today's workshop, Sam. And first thing this morning, I received messages for them to say, sorry, we can't attend. So that it's those types of people that I've been very grateful and fortunate to meet along the way, that they inspire me every day, and they're my support network as well.
So inspiration is everywhere. It doesn't have to be someone famous, and we can draw inspirations from everyday people that even we know in that sense. So thanks a lot, Kavita. How about you, Teresa?
Oh, I'll keep it very short and say, I think it's the unsung heroes, the people that don't really get the recognition, that are just getting up and getting out there and doing the stuff that needs to be done. There's a gal who in my neighborhood whose job it is to gather, cardboard boxes together. And she's got this trolley that's as long as a barge that she goes down the street with. And I think to myself, you don't know how tough other people's lives are. You have a bad day and you think, oh gosh, and I was late to my lunch appointment, and you're forgetting that there are people that are doing hard work every single day to make our lives simpler and better. So those are the people that really I admire.
So we have about, about 7 more minutes or so before we conclude the session. Maybe I'll have two more questions. The first question to both of you is, if there's one takeaway from today's session, right, that you want everyone to just get started, the call to action basically, what would that be? Maybe starting from Kavita for a start.
I would say be clear on what it is that you want out of this, right? That it took me a while to figure that out, and reach out to somebody for some support to help you form that. Earlier on this week, my boss, Priti, who's the managing director for Diageo Southeast Asia, she gave us some little insights in terms of her career journey, and said something that was very poignant and so true for me, at least, which is, whenever she's been asked to mentor somebody, she's never said no, and as have I've never said no. And whenever she's reached out to somebody for help, whether to be coached, to run something by them, or to be mentored, nobody also has said no to her. And it can seem, especially in the current environment where we're all working remotely, for my team and I, it's been 1 year. And so it's so much harder to, you've got to make that extra effort. So I would say that's a really, really great starting point. And in terms, have a think about, what it is that you want to be known for. What is your signature, and a touch, and how are you going to bring real flavor to that, to tell your story?
Okay, cool. Teresa?
Thank you.
I would say a couple of things. One is to go in curious. Be interested to see if the job interview is something that is a good fit for you. I would also say that the idea of, with a personal brand, being honest with yourself, not only about your successes, but also your failures, because lying within both of those are your character. And that's what this brand thing to me is really all about, is understanding who you are so that you can use that as a compass guide for the big decisions that you'll have to make in life, and also negotiating the relationships that you are going to face, some of them very difficult to manage in the workplace. So I would say getting honest with yourself about your own strengths and shortcomings is a good starting point.
Okay, so being honest with yourself, what I'm hearing is reaching out, finding your signature and what you really stand for. One final question, right? So this International Women's Day is about how you choose to challenge. So the question to both of you, starting from Teresa, what do you choose to challenge this year to help drive equality and opportunity for women? Followed by Kavita.
Gosh, I think it's a matter of involving myself in more projects that are specifically focused on opportunities for women. I think that, for the first part of my career, a lot of it has been spent, 90% of my clients have been men. And so a lot of my time is spent talking to men, but I think being determined to get more involved in women's project. In fact, I'm going to be doing some pro bono work for the Women's Foundation on storytelling this weekend, over the next few months.
Thank you. How about Kavita?
Thanks, Sam. I was having a conversation with one of my team a few weeks ago, and I've had many conversations like this. And so what I'm going to choose to challenge, because I think it's really relevant in currently what's happening in the world, is choosing to challenge how I, as a leader, or how I can influence the business that I work for to ensure that we keep women in the workplace. There is a stat, and I can't remember the exact percentage, so please excuse me, but it's quite a high number of percentage of women, because of the current situation around homeschooling, working from home full time, etc., childcare challenges, nurseries not open, that have dropped out of the workforce. So how do we, as employers and businesses and as an industry, ensure that we have all of the right flex working in place so that women can succeed whilst still managing their family. And it's not always about children. You know, there's women who have responsibilities for their in-laws, for their parents, etc. So when I mean, we have you know, we launched something called Flex Philosophy at Diageo last year. So really unlocking what flex philosophy means. There is not a one size fits all for everybody. So I'm going to truly choose to challenge this and make it a better place to work for my team.
Thank you, Kavita. Thank you, Teresa. I wish you all success, and I believe all of us, after listening to your story, just inspired our journey as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your participation, all your questions, and once again, thank you, Diageo, for supporting us on this journey itself. Teresa, Kavita, pleasure meeting you, pleasure working with you. With that, we'll speak soon. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kavita.
Thank you guys. Wonderful
Thanks,
sharing.
Teresa.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.